The morning sun cast long shadows across the military academy's parade ground as Lieutenant Sarah Chen adjusted her uniform for the third time. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the anticipation that had been building for weeks. Today marked the beginning of the Advanced Strategic Operations course, a program that could make or break a military career. Only the most promising officers were selected, and Sarah had fought tooth and nail to earn her place among the 30 candidates. As she walked toward the imposing brick building that housed the Academy's main lecture hall, Sarah couldn't help but notice the stares from her fellow officers. Some were curious, others skeptical. At 28, she was younger than most of her peers, and her petite frame often led people to underestimate her capabilities. But Sarah had learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving, and she had built her career on proving doubters wrong. The lecture hall buzzed with nervous energy as the candidates filed in. Sarah chose a seat in the middle section, close enough to demonstrate engagement but not so forward as to appear overeager. She recognized several faces from previous assignments, nodding politely to those who acknowledged her presence. The atmosphere was thick with competition and ambition. At exactly 0800 hours, the heavy wooden doors at the front of the hall burst open. Colonel Marcus Blackwood strode in with the kind of authority that could silence a room instantly. His uniform was immaculate, his silver hair perfectly groomed, and his chest displayed an impressive array of ribbons and medals accumulated over 3 decades of service. He was a legend in military circles, known for his tactical brilliance and his ability to transform average officers into exceptional leaders. Colonel Blackwood's eyes swept across the room, taking inventory of each candidate. When his gaze fell upon Sarah, it lingered for a moment longer than necessary. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a slight tightening around the eyes that suggested disapproval or perhaps amusement. "Ladies and gentlemen," the colonel began, his voice carrying easily through the hall without the need for amplification, "welcome to Advanced Strategic Operations. Over the next 6 months, you will be pushed beyond your limits. You will question everything you think you know about leadership, strategy, and warfare. Many of you will fail. Some of you," his eyes found Sarah again, "probably shouldn't have been selected in the first place." A ripple of discomfort passed through the room. Sarah felt her cheeks warm but kept her expression neutral. She had faced worse comments during her 10 years of service, and she wasn't about to let this intimidate her now. "This course is designed for serious military professionals," Colonel Blackwood continued, beginning to pace across the front of the room. "It requires physical stamina, mental toughness, and the kind of strategic thinking that can only come from real combat experience. It's not a place for those who've spent their careers behind desks or in comfortable administrative positions." The implication was clear, and Sarah felt the weight of her classmates' glances. Her service record included 3 overseas deployments, 2 commendations for valor, and a master's degree in international relations, but she knew that Colonel Blackwood was referring to her current assignment in the Intelligence Division. Many line officers viewed intelligence work as less demanding than frontline combat roles. "Let's begin with introductions," the colonel announced, pointing to a tall officer in the front row. "You there, Captain Morrison. Tell us about yourself." One by one, the candidates stood to introduce themselves. Each recounted their service history, their specializations, and their goals for the course. The stories were impressive: tank commanders who had led successful operations in hostile territory, infantry officers who had distinguished themselves in urban warfare, pilots who had flown dangerous missions behind enemy lines. When it came to Sarah's turn, she stood with practiced composure. "Lieutenant Sarah Chen, Intelligence Division. I've served for 10 years, including deployments to Afghanistan, Syria, and Eastern Europe. I hold a master's degree in international relations and have specialized in strategic analysis and counterintelligence operations." Colonel Blackwood's eyebrows rose slightly. "Intelligence Division," he repeated, as if the words left a bad taste in his mouth. "And what makes you think you belong in a course designed for combat leaders, Lieutenant Chen? Have you ever actually led troops in battle, or have you spent your entire career analyzing reports from behind the safety of a computer screen?" The room fell silent. Sarah could feel the tension ratcheting up, but she had anticipated this moment. Sir, my role in intelligence has involved coordinating with frontline units during active operations. I've been embedded with combat teams and have participated in planning and executing strategic missions that directly impacted battlefield outcomes. Embedded, the colonel repeated with obvious skepticism. That's a fancy way of saying you were along for the ride while real soldiers did the fighting. A few uncomfortable chuckles echoed through the room. Tell me, Lieutenant, when was the last time you had to make a split-second decision that could mean life or death for the soldiers under your command? Sarah's jaw tightened slightly, but her voice remained steady. 6 months ago in Syria, sir. I was coordinating intelligence for a rescue operation when our primary extraction route was compromised. I had to redirect 3 squads through hostile territory based on real-time intelligence analysis. All personnel made it out safely. Coordinating, Colonel Blackwood said dismissively. Redirecting. More fancy words for sitting safely in a command post while others took the real risks. He turned to address the entire class. This is exactly what I'm talking about, people. Modern military has become soft, filled with officers who think strategic thinking can replace battlefield experience. Lieutenant Chen here probably believes that her computer models and intelligence reports make her qualified to lead real soldiers in real combat situations. The humiliation burned in Sarah's chest, but she forced herself to remain standing at attention. Years of dealing with similar attitudes had taught her that responding emotionally would only reinforce their prejudices. Instead, she filed away every word, every gesture, every slight for future reference. Sir, I respectfully disagree, she said quietly. Intelligence operations require the same leadership skills, quick thinking, and ability to operate under pressure as any combat role. The only difference is that our battlefield is information, and our weapons are analysis and strategic thinking. Colonel Blackwood laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the hall. Weapons are analysis. Strategic thinking? He shook his head in apparent disbelief. Lieutenant, in real combat, your weapons better be something more substantial than a college degree and a computer. When bullets are flying and soldiers are dying, what matters is experience, instinct, and the kind of leadership that can only be forged in the heat of battle. He gestured broadly to the room. Look around you, Lieutenant Chen. These are proven combat leaders. Tank commanders, infantry officers, special operations veterans. They've earned their place here through blood, sweat, and battlefield-proven leadership. You've earned yours through paperwork and political correctness. The accusation hit like a physical blow. Sarah knew that some people believed she had advanced through the ranks because of diversity initiatives rather than merit, but hearing it stated so bluntly in front of her peers was devastating. She could see some of her classmates nodding in agreement with the colonel's assessment. I can assure you, sir, that my advancement has been based solely on performance and merit, Sarah replied, her voice growing firmer despite the emotional turmoil she felt inside. Performance in what? Colonel Blackwood shot back. Writing reports? Attending briefings? Lieutenant, this course will expose the difference between real leadership and bureaucratic achievement. When we put you in realistic combat scenarios, when we strip away your computers and your support staff and your comfortable office environment, we'll see what you're really made of. He paused dramatically, letting his words sink in. I predict that you'll be among the first to wash out. Not because you're not intelligent, I'm sure you're very smart. But because intelligence without experience is just theory, and theory doesn't save lives in combat. Sarah remained standing as Colonel Blackwood moved on to the next candidate, but she barely heard the continuing introductions. Her mind was reeling from the public humiliation, but underneath the embarrassment, something else was building. It was a familiar feeling, one that had driven her through every challenge of her military career, the burning determination to prove her critics wrong. As the introductions continued, Sarah began to study Colonel Blackwood more carefully. His confidence was absolute, his bearing commanding, but she noticed small details that others might miss. The way he favored his left leg slightly when he turned. The brief pause he took before answering certain questions. The almost imperceptible tension in his shoulders when discussing modern military doctrine. These were the kinds of observations that made Sarah exceptional at her job. While others saw only the surface presentation, she analyzed patterns, identified weaknesses, and constructed comprehensive pictures from small details. It was a skill that had served her well in intelligence work, and she suspected it might prove valuable in this course as well. When the introductions finally concluded, Colonel Blackwood outlined the structure of the program. It would consist of classroom instruction, practical exercises, war games, and, ultimately, a complex final exercise that would test everything they had learned. Each phase would eliminate the weakest performers until only the top candidates remained. The attrition rate for this course is typically around 60%, he announced with obvious satisfaction. Those who survive will be qualified for the most challenging leadership positions in our military. Those who don't will return to their previous assignments with a better understanding of their limitations. As the session ended and candidates began filing out of the lecture hall, Sarah remained in her seat, processing everything that had happened. The humiliation stung, but it had also crystallized her purpose. Colonel Blackwood had made assumptions about her based on stereotypes and limited understanding of what intelligence work actually entailed. He had dismissed her qualifications, questioned her right to be there, and essentially predicted her failure in front of her peers. What he didn't know was that Sarah Chen had built her entire career on exceeding expectations and proving doubters wrong. Every challenge she had faced, from basic training to her most recent deployment, had been an opportunity to demonstrate that appearances could be deceiving and that true strength often came in unexpected packages. As she finally stood to leave, Sarah caught her reflection in one of the tall windows that lined the lecture hall. She saw a young woman in a crisp military uniform, her posture straight and her expression determined. What Colonel Blackwood saw as weakness, she would transform into strength. What he viewed as liability, she would prove to be an asset. The real education was about to begin, and Sarah Chen was more ready than ever to show exactly what she was capable of accomplishing. Colonel Blackwood had made the mistake of underestimating her, and she intended to make sure it was a mistake he would never forget. The first week of the Advanced Strategic Operations course proved to be everything Colonel Blackwood had promised and more. Each day began at 0500 hours with physical training that pushed the candidates to their limits. Sarah had always maintained excellent fitness standards, but the combination of distance running, obstacle courses, and combat conditioning exercises left even the strongest officers exhausted by breakfast. The academic portion of the program was equally demanding. Classes covered advanced military doctrine, international law, resource management, and strategic planning at levels far beyond what most officers encountered in their regular assignments. Sarah found herself working late into the night, studying tactical manuals and preparing for the next day's discussions. Despite her preparation, Colonel Blackwood seemed determined to make her experience as difficult as possible. During classroom discussions, he would single her out with the most challenging questions, often prefacing them with comments about whether someone from intelligence could handle real-world scenarios. When she provided thoughtful, well-researched answers, he would dismiss them as textbook responses that showed no understanding of battlefield realities. The other candidates began to take notice of this pattern. Some, like Captain Morrison and Major Rodriguez, seemed sympathetic to Sarah's situation and would offer encouraging nods when she performed well despite the colonel's criticism. Others, however, appeared to view the instructor's behavior as confirmation that Sarah didn't belong in the program. The first major test came during the second week with a tactical planning exercise. The candidates were divided into teams of 6 and given a complex scenario, a hostage rescue operation in an urban environment with limited intelligence and hostile civilian populations. Each team had 4 hours to develop a comprehensive plan and present it to Colonel Blackwood and a panel of senior officers. Sarah found herself assigned to Team Charlie, along with Captain Morrison, Lieutenant Commander Walsh from the Navy, Captain Torres from the Air Force, Major Kumar from the Army Rangers, and Lieutenant Phillips, a young Marine officer who had distinguished himself in recent deployments. The team dynamics were immediately apparent. Morrison and Kumar naturally assumed leadership roles, while Walsh and Torres focused on their respective specialties. Phillips seemed eager to prove himself, and Sarah quickly realized she would need to find her own way to contribute. As the team began analyzing the scenario, Sarah noticed several details that others had overlooked. The timing of the hostage situation coincided with a local religious festival, which would affect traffic patterns and civilian movement. The building layout suggested that the hostage-takers had chosen their location carefully, with multiple escape routes and excellent fields of fire. Most importantly, the intelligence reports contained subtle inconsistencies that suggested the situation might not be exactly what it appeared. "Wait," Sarah interjected during the team's initial planning discussion. "Look at these intelligence reports more carefully. The timeline doesn't add up. The first report says the hostages were taken at 0800 hours, but the witness statements describe seeing the suspects enter the building at 0645. That's more than an hour discrepancy." Captain Morrison paused in his explanation of assault tactics to look at the documents. "You're right. That is strange. What do you think it means?" "It could mean several things," Sarah replied, spreading the papers across the table. "Either our intelligence is wrong, which would affect everything we're planning, or the situation is more complex than we initially thought. What if this isn't a straightforward hostage situation? What if it's designed to draw us into a trap?" Major Kumar frowned. "That seems like a stretch. Sometimes intelligence reports have minor discrepancies. It doesn't necessarily mean anything sinister." "Maybe," Sarah conceded, "but look at this." She pointed to a map of the surrounding area. "The building they've chosen is here, right at this intersection. It's not ideal for holding hostages, too many escape routes for the hostages, too many ways for security forces to approach. But it would be perfect for an ambush if you wanted to draw rescue forces into a kill zone." Lieutenant Commander Walsh leaned forward, studying the map more intently. "She might be onto something. If I were planning an ambush, this is exactly the kind of location I'd choose. Multiple firing positions, clear fields of observation, and limited approach routes for the good guys." The team spent the next hour revising their plan based on Sarah's analysis. Instead of a straightforward rescue operation, they developed a more cautious approach that assumed the possibility of an ambush. They planned for multiple contingencies, established overwatch positions, and included extensive intelligence gathering as part of their initial phase. When the presentations began, Team Charlie was scheduled third. Sarah watched as the first two teams presented conventional rescue plans that focused primarily on speed and overwhelming force. Both received polite but lukewarm responses from the evaluation panel. When their turn came, Captain Morrison took the lead in presenting their plan, but he made sure to acknowledge Sarah's contributions to their analysis. "Our initial assessment was significantly enhanced by Lieutenant Chen's detailed intelligence review, which identified several potential complications that other teams may have overlooked." Colonel Blackwood's expression remained neutral, but Sarah noticed the slight tightening around his eyes that she had begun to recognize as his tell when he was irritated. As Morrison continued the presentation, explaining their multi-phase approach and contingency planning, the colonel interrupted several times with sharp questions about timing, resource allocation, and risk assessment. "This plan seems overly complicated," he commented when Morrison finished. "In a hostage situation, speed is often more important than extensive planning. Every minute you spend on reconnaissance and overwatch is another minute the hostages are in danger." Sarah felt compelled to respond. "Sir, with respect, our analysis suggests this might not be a straightforward hostage situation. The intelligence discrepancies and location choice indicate a high probability of ambush. A rushed assault could result in significant casualties among both hostages and rescue personnel." "Lieutenant Chen," Colonel Blackwood's voice carried a warning tone, "you're making assumptions based on minor inconsistencies in intelligence reports. In real combat situations, you don't have the luxury of perfect information or unlimited time for analysis. Sometimes you have to act on incomplete intelligence and trust your training and instincts." "I understand that, sir," Sarah replied carefully, "but in intelligence work, minor inconsistencies often reveal major problems. Ignoring these details can lead to mission failure or unnecessary casualties." "Intelligence work," the colonel repeated with obvious disdain. "Lieutenant, this exercise is about tactical leadership and combat decision-making, not about sitting in an office and analyzing reports. In real combat, you need to be able to make decisions quickly and commit to action, even when you don't have all the information you'd like to have." The tension in the room was palpable. Sarah could feel the eyes of her teammates and classmates upon her, watching to see how she would respond to this latest challenge to her credibility. She had been preparing for this moment since the course began, knowing that eventually Colonel Blackwood would push her to a breaking point. "Sir," she said, standing at attention, "I would argue that intelligence analysis is a form of tactical decision-making. When I was embedded with special operations teams in Syria, my ability to quickly analyze incomplete information and identify potential threats saved lives on multiple occasions. Intelligence work requires the same kind of quick thinking and decisive action as any combat role, we just use different tools and operate in a different environment." Colonel Blackwood stepped closer, his voice dropping to a more conversational tone that somehow seemed more intimidating than his earlier volume. "Tell me about Syria, Lieutenant Chen. Tell me about one of these life-saving decisions you made." Sarah hesitated for just a moment, knowing that whatever she said would be scrutinized and likely dismissed. There was an operation to capture a high-value target in Aleppo. Initial intelligence suggested he was operating from a specific compound, but when I analyzed the communication intercepts and movement patterns, I identified inconsistencies that suggested we were being fed false information. "Go on," the colonel prompted. "I recommended delaying the operation for additional surveillance, but the local commander was eager to proceed. I insisted on repositioning our overwatch teams based on my analysis of likely escape routes and potential ambush sites. When the operation began, the compound was indeed empty, but enemy fighters were positioned exactly where my analysis had predicted. Because we had repositioned our overwatch, we were able to eliminate the ambush and capture the target when he attempted to flee through what he thought was a safe route." The room was silent as Sarah finished her account. She could see some of her classmates nodding with apparent respect for her experience, while others seemed skeptical of her story. Colonel Blackwood studied her for a long moment. "An interesting story, Lieutenant. But I notice you said you insisted on repositioning the overwatch teams. How exactly does a lieutenant in intelligence insist that a ground commander change his tactical plan? That suggests either insubordination on your part or poor leadership on his part." Sarah felt the trap closing around her. Any answer she gave would either make her sound insubordinate or would disparage a fellow officer. "Sir, I presented my analysis and recommendations through proper channels. The commander made the final decision based on all available information." "That's not what you said before," Colonel Blackwood pressed. "You said you insisted. That implies you continued to push your recommendations even after they were considered. That sounds like an intelligence officer overstepping her bounds and interfering with command decisions." The accusation stung because it touched on one of the most sensitive aspects of intelligence work, the balance between providing analysis and respecting command authority. Sarah had indeed been persistent in her recommendations, but only because she had been convinced that lives were at stake. "Sir, my responsibility was to provide the best possible intelligence support to the operation. When I identified a significant threat, I felt obligated to ensure that information was properly communicated and understood." "Felt obligated," Colonel Blackwood repeated. "Lieutenant, in military operations, feeling obligated to second-guess your commanding officers is called insubordination. The fact that your analysis turned out to be correct doesn't justify undermining command authority." Sarah realized that no matter what she said, Colonel Blackwood would find a way to twist it against her. The story she had shared to demonstrate her capabilities had instead become another weapon for him to use in questioning her fitness for the program. "I understand your point, sir," she said simply, knowing that further argument would only dig her deeper into the hole. Colonel Blackwood seemed satisfied with having made his point. He turned back to the evaluation panel. "As I was saying, this exercise reveals the importance of decisive leadership and clear command authority. When junior officers start questioning tactical decisions and insisting on alternative approaches, it undermines unit cohesion and mission effectiveness." As the presentations continued with the remaining teams, Sarah sat quietly, processing what had just happened. Colonel Blackwood had taken her example of professional competence and reframed it as evidence of poor discipline and overreach. It was a masterful display of rhetorical manipulation, and she had walked right into it. But, as she reflected on the exchange, Sarah began to see a different pattern. Colonel Blackwood's criticism wasn't really about her actions in Syria or her performance in the current exercise. It was about his fundamental belief that intelligence officers, particularly young female intelligence officers, didn't belong in combat leadership roles. Every challenge he presented was designed to reinforce that prejudice, regardless of how she responded. When the exercise concluded, Team Charlie received the highest marks from the evaluation panel for their thorough analysis and comprehensive planning. The panel particularly praised their identification of potential ambush indicators and their development of appropriate countermeasures. Several panel members specifically mentioned the quality of their intelligence analysis. Colonel Blackwood's expression during the scoring announcement was carefully neutral, but Sarah caught the slight muscle tension in his jaw that indicated his displeasure with the results. As the candidates filed out of the classroom, she overheard him speaking quietly with one of the panel members about the importance of not encouraging overthinking in tactical situations. That evening, as Sarah studied in her quarters, she received a visit from Captain Morrison. He knocked quietly and waited for permission to enter, then closed the door behind him. "I wanted to apologize for what happened in there," he said without preamble. "That was unprofessional and unfair." Sarah looked up from her books, surprised by his directness. "Thank you, but you don't need to apologize. You didn't do anything wrong." "Maybe not, but I didn't do anything right either," Morrison replied. "I should have spoken up when he was attacking your credibility like that. Your analysis was spot on, and the whole team benefited from your insights." "I appreciate that," Sarah said sincerely, "but I don't need you to fight my battles for me. This is something I have to handle myself." Morrison nodded, understanding her position. "For what it's worth, I think you're going to do fine in this program. Better than fine, actually. I've been in combat with officers who had half your analytical ability and twice your rank. The military needs more people who can think the way you do." After he left, Sarah returned to her studies with renewed determination. Colonel Blackwood had shown his hand today, revealing both his prejudices and his tactics. Now she knew what she was up against, and she could plan accordingly. The next phase of the program would involve more complex exercises and greater challenges, but Sarah Chen had spent her entire career overcoming obstacles and exceeding expectations. What Colonel Blackwood didn't realize was that every attempt to humiliate her only strengthened her resolve. Every challenge designed to make her fail became an opportunity to demonstrate her capabilities. And every assumption he made about her limitations was another chance to prove him wrong. The real test was just beginning, and Sarah intended to pass with distinction. The third week of the program brought the first major elimination exercise. 5 candidates had already withdrawn from the course, unable to keep pace with the demanding schedule and rigorous standards. The remaining 25 officers would face a comprehensive field exercise designed to test every aspect of their training so far. Colonel Blackwood announced the exercise during Monday morning's briefing, his voice carrying across the lecture hall with its usual authority. "This week, you will participate in Operation Thunderstrike, a 5-day field exercise that will simulate a complex multi-phase military campaign. You will be divided into 3 competing forces, each responsible for achieving specific objectives while preventing the others from achieving theirs." He clicked a remote, and a detailed map appeared on the large screen behind him. The terrain was challenging, a mixture of hills, forests, and urban environments that would test both tactical planning and physical endurance. Each force will be commanded by officers selected based on their performance thus far, the colonel continued. These commanders will have complete authority over their units and will be responsible for all strategic and tactical decisions. Success or failure will depend entirely on their leadership capabilities. Sarah felt a knot forming in her stomach. She had performed well academically and had contributed significantly to every team exercise, but she knew that Colonel Blackwood would never select her for a command position. True to form, when he announced the 3 commanders, her name was not among them. Instead, he chose Major Rodriguez, Captain Stevens, and Lieutenant Colonel Harper, all experienced line officers with impressive combat records. The remaining candidates will be assigned to these 3 forces, Colonel Blackwood announced. However, this exercise includes an additional element that will test your adaptability and leadership under pressure. At various points during the operation, circumstances may require changes in command structure. Officers must be prepared to assume leadership responsibilities at any level, regardless of their initial assignment. Sarah was assigned to Blue Force under Major Rodriguez's command, along with 7 other candidates including Captain Morrison and Lieutenant Phillips. As they gathered for their initial planning session, Sarah couldn't help but notice that she had been assigned the role of intelligence coordinator, essentially the same support function she held in her regular duties. Major Rodriguez was a competent officer with extensive experience in armored warfare. He listened respectfully to input from his team members and seemed genuinely interested in Sarah's analytical capabilities. However, Sarah could sense an underlying assumption that her role would remain primarily advisory rather than operational. The exercise began on Wednesday at 0400 hours. Blue Force was assigned the mission of securing a series of strategic objectives while preventing Red Force and Green Force from accomplishing their own goals. The terrain was unfamiliar, the timeline was aggressive, and enemy capabilities were intentionally vague, exactly the kind of scenario where intelligence analysis could make the difference between success and failure. Sarah threw herself into the role with characteristic intensity. She coordinated with forward reconnaissance teams, analyzed enemy movement patterns, and developed detailed assessments of likely opposition strategies. Her predictions about Green Force's approach routes proved accurate when they attempted exactly the flanking maneuver she had anticipated. Her analysis of Red Force's supply requirements led to the successful interdiction of a critical resupply convoy. By the second day of the exercise, Blue Force had achieved 2 of their 3 primary objectives and was ahead of schedule on the third. Major Rodriguez publicly praised Sarah's intelligence work and relied heavily on her assessments for tactical planning. The other team members began seeking her input on operational decisions, recognizing her ability to see patterns and anticipate enemy actions. But, on Thursday morning, everything changed. Major Rodriguez was conducting a forward reconnaissance when his vehicle hit a simulated mine. According to the exercise rules, he was declared a casualty and removed from the field. Command of Blue Force passed to the senior remaining officer, Captain Morrison. Morrison was an excellent tactical leader, but he lacked Rodriguez's experience with complex multi-unit operations. As Blue Force faced their most challenging objective, a time-sensitive assault on a heavily defended position, Morrison found himself overwhelmed by the number of variables and decisions required. "Sarah," he said during an emergency planning session, "I need your help. Not just intelligence support, but operational planning. You've been tracking everything that's happening across the entire battlefield. What do you think our best approach is?" Sarah looked around the command post at the faces of her teammates. They were all looking to her for answers, despite the fact that most of them outranked her and had more frontline combat experience. It was a moment she had been preparing for her entire career. The conventional approach would be a direct assault supported by artillery, she began, spreading maps across the makeshift table. But our intelligence suggests that Red Force is expecting that. They've positioned their strongest defenses along the most obvious approach routes. She traced alternative paths on the map with her finger. However, there's a weakness in their positioning here. They've assumed that the river provides adequate protection for their eastern flank, but our reconnaissance shows that water levels are lower than normal due to the recent drought. A small force could cross here and establish a blocking position while our main force conducts a supporting attack from the north. Lieutenant Phillips studied the plan. That would require splitting our force and coordinating 2 separate attacks. The timing would have to be perfect. It would, Sarah agreed. But it's the only approach that gives us a reasonable chance of success within our time constraints. A frontal assault would likely fail, and even if it succeeded, we'd take heavy casualties that would prevent us from holding the position. Morrison looked uncertain. "I don't know. It seems awfully complicated. Maybe we should stick with the straightforward approach." "Sir," Sarah said carefully, "I know it's complex, but sometimes complex problems require complex solutions. This is exactly the kind of situation where conventional tactics fail and creative thinking makes the difference." The debate continued for several minutes, with team members offering various perspectives and concerns. Sarah realized that Morrison was paralyzed by the weight of command responsibility and the fear of making the wrong decision. She had seen this before in officers who were more comfortable following orders than giving them. Finally, Sarah made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. "Captain Morrison, I believe you should let me coordinate this operation." The command post fell silent. Even suggesting such a thing bordered on insubordination. A junior lieutenant asking to assume operational control from a senior captain was virtually unprecedented. "That's not possible," Morrison replied immediately. "You don't have the rank or the experience for that kind of responsibility." "Sir, with respect, rank and experience aren't what we need right now," Sarah said firmly. "We need someone who understands the complete tactical picture and can coordinate multiple moving parts simultaneously. That's exactly what intelligence officers do. We analyze complex situations and develop comprehensive solutions." Lieutenant Commander Walsh, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "She's been right about everything so far, Jim. Her analysis has been spot on, and she's the only one who seems to have a clear picture of what all three forces are doing." "This is crazy," Phillips interjected. "She's never commanded troops in combat. This isn't a computer simulation. If she screws up, people die." "In a real situation, yes," Sarah acknowledged. "But this is a training exercise designed to test our capabilities under pressure. If there was ever a time to take calculated risks and test unconventional approaches, this is it." Morrison was clearly torn. The safe choice was to stick with conventional tactics and accept probable failure. The risky choice was to trust a junior officer with an untested approach that might succeed brilliantly or fail spectacularly. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked finally. Sarah moved to the map board and began outlining her plan in detail. She had been thinking about this approach since the previous evening, refining the timing and logistics in her mind. Her proposal involved 3 coordinated phases: a diversionary attack to fix enemy attention, a crossing operation to establish the blocking position, and a final assault that would crush enemy forces between 2 advancing elements. "The key is timing," she explained. "Phase 1 begins at 1,400 hours with our diversionary attack here. That draws their reserves north and commits their heavy weapons. Phase 2 starts 15 minutes later with Lieutenant Phillips leading a small crossing team here. They have 30 minutes to establish the blocking position and call for fire support. Phase 3 begins at 14:45 with our main assault from this direction." She looked around the group. "Each phase depends on the others. If the diversion fails, the crossing team gets massacred. If the crossing fails, the main assault walks into a crossfire. If the main assault fails, the crossing team gets cut off and destroyed. But if all 3 phases work together, we achieve surprise, concentrate our forces at the decisive point, and complete the mission with minimal casualties." Morrison studied the plan carefully, asking detailed questions about logistics, communications, and contingencies. Gradually, Sarah could see his confidence growing as he understood how each element fit together. "Okay," he said finally. "Let's do it. But I want to be clear, this is still my command. You'll coordinate the operation, but I retain overall responsibility and final authority." "Understood, sir," Sarah replied. "I wouldn't want it any other way." The next 3 hours were a whirlwind of preparation and coordination. Sarah found herself managing radio communications, coordinating with supporting units, and adjusting plans based on changing intelligence. It was exactly the kind of complex, multivariable situation that played to her strengths as an intelligence officer. At 1,400 hours, the diversionary attack began exactly as planned. Red Force took the bait, committing their reserves and heavy weapons to counter what appeared to be Blue Force's main assault. 15 minutes later, Phillips led his crossing team through the shallow river and began establishing their blocking position. Sarah monitored the entire operation from the command post, tracking friendly and enemy positions, coordinating artillery support, and making real-time adjustments as the situation developed. When Green Force unexpectedly appeared on Blue Force's left flank, threatening to disrupt the entire operation, Sarah quickly diverted 2 squads to contain them while maintaining the integrity of her main plan. At 14:45, the main assault began. Red Force found themselves caught between two advancing elements, unable to concentrate their forces effectively against either threat. Within 30 minutes, they had surrendered their position and Blue Force had achieved their final objective. As the exercise concluded and units began consolidating their positions, word of Blue Force's success spread quickly through the training area. The operation had been executed flawlessly, achieving all objectives ahead of schedule with minimal simulated casualties. Colonel Blackwood arrived at Blue Force's command post shortly after the exercise ended, his expression unreadable as he reviewed the operation reports and spoke with the participants. Sarah watched nervously as he questioned Morrison and other team members about their tactics and decision-making process. "Captain Morrison," the colonel said finally, "this was an impressive operation. Unconventional, risky, but ultimately successful. Walk me through your planning process." Morrison straightened. "Sir, the operation was planned and coordinated by Lieutenant Chen. She identified the tactical opportunity, developed the concept, and managed the execution. I retain